Hi, everybody. Tim Hughes here. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DLA Ignite. With me today, I've got Mike Klein. Mike is a principal at Changing the Terms, and he's a senior advisor to Smarp Strategic Services. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Whenever I start this, I always ask the first question is, where can people get hold of you from today?
Well, the easiest way to get a hold of me these days is at my email, which is Mike Klein, Mike.Klein at changingtheterms.com. I'm also known as Mike Klein on LinkedIn, and I'm easily accessible there as well.
Good, thank you. So today we're going to talk about internal and external comms. Before we get into that, it'd just be worth to give some context in terms of your background, because you have a real interesting background in terms of what you did before you did your MBA.
Well, I got my MBA a little over 20 years ago from London Business School.
Yeah.
And before that, I primarily managed political campaigns in the U.S., mainly in the American South, for about 10 years. And then coming out of business school, I was trying to figure out what to do, how I could commercialize my skills, stumbled into the career field of internal communication, where I have been for over 20 years.
And I think it's really interesting that your that background, because there's a lot of people that come from, say, a marketing background, but what you were doing in the political field was actually getting people to do something, which is go out and vote.
That's correct, and not just in getting them to do something, but also in addressing them as people who have the right, the ability, and the willingness to do so. So that kind of is what set me apart from a lot of internal communications folks, particularly earlier in my career, when the focus was often on behaviors or facilitation or top-down type communication. There was often an omission of the basic fact, which is that employees have the ability to say yes or no to everything that they're doing. And granted, there are consequences of saying yes, consequences of saying no, but the difference was that the belief in the employee as an agent with a certain degree of freedom of choice is something that was structurally missing from internal communication in its infancy, 20 plus years ago. And even through the whole era in which internal communication was conflated with employee engagement, there was the lack of recognition of the ability of the employee to connect with other people, to communicate with other people, to build coalitions or collectively defend themselves in an organizational context.
So explain to people the difference between internal and external communications and the differences and nuances of that.
Well, at a very basic level, internal communication is what you say to your employees, and external communication is what you say to everybody else who isn't an employee. In reality, there's a bit of fluidity. Contractors are working for you, but they aren't employees. People who are super users and advocates of yours in the marketplace don't necessarily live on your payroll, but need to have a somewhat higher degree of information about you, your products, and your services if they're going to be effective advocates beyond that firewall. So, it's ultimately, I would like to see the differentiator be the degree of involvement with the organization, rather than just simply the extent to which one's on the payroll or not. But I think we're still some ways from really seeing people thinking that way on a consistent basis.
And you talk about internal communications involving the employees, but also involving customers and ultimately advocates as well. I mean, you've used the term citizen advocacy as a catch-all for all of this. Explain that to us.
Well, I think the big issue is, what is it that's at play? Is it the organization's ability to win in the marketplace? Is it the ability of the organization to drive, align, move forward, in terms of the way it produces stuff, in terms of what it produces, in terms of how it, how people in the organization behave as they do it. There's, all of these have, elements of people participating and people talking and people communicating. I think the key thing is recognition of the role of people as participants, as opposed to being just simply a bunch of passive people, who are in either doing a single activity or no activity at all. Like just calling customers customers. It's like there are lots of different kinds of customers. Audiences. We don't have thousands of people sitting in rooms looking passively at the screen and nodding their heads. It's more about the extent to which people participate and how that participation can be influenced and channeled in productive or non-productive ways.
So you talked about the I really like this in the when we were prepping this, which is the Abraham Lincoln election rules, which kind of has an impact in terms of employee advocacy, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, Abraham Lincoln back in 1840, well before he got elected president, had a list of rules for running successful political campaigns. And the rules were: make a perfect list of the voters, determine with certainty who the voters will support. For those who are undecided, send someone in whom they trust to persuade them, and turn out all of the good party members, no matter, depending on what the party was, on election day. And I actually wrote a book on how to apply this to an organizational context. It's called From Lincoln to LinkedIn. I actually can send you a PDF, or send anybody a PDF who's interested. But the idea is, we're all kind of driving decisions and endpoints. And a lot of what goes on, particularly in internal communication, because targeting and strategy in internal comms has always been less sophisticated than it's been in marketing comms, for instance. You spend a lot of time communicating with people who either have nothing to do with the outcome that you're seeking, or who actually have something to do with that outcome, but are constitutionally indifferent or opposed. And so what you're doing is you're spending a lot of money and a lot of time, not just to cause these people to be inundated with irrelevance, but you're actively mobilizing your own opposition. And to do that for sake of not wanting to spend a few bucks on an employee communication portal or platform, or because you don't think it's fair to discriminate internally or whatever, you're actually spending money to do counterproductive things.
So yeah, go on.
It's insane to do that, but that's been the standard MO of internal communication until really fairly recently, until we started seeing more intelligent internal communication platforms emerge.
So I mean, one of the things that we talked about is that employees now expect to see that there's a need to have content. And you talk about a creative interplay between sharing, creating, and sharing with each other. And Absolutely. Employees expecting that and coming to work and expecting that. And I certainly agree with that.
Well, I mean, internally and externally, you have opinion leaders. You have people who are influencers. Sometimes they're influential on social platforms. Sometimes they're influential on non-social platforms, or on kind of the original social platforms, like what was commonly known as the grapevine. And it's key to figure out not just what these people are saying, but really who these people are. Because some people are very loud in social media. Some people post a lot of stuff. Some people post a lot of specifically very different types of stuff. And, if you were to look at the feed, you'd think, oh, these are the influencers. Well, these are people who want to be influencers, and some of them are influential and some of them aren't. What's much harder to find are the influencers who are flying below the social media radar. Um, and I've done a fair amount of work in this space, and I do a bit with a firm in Copenhagen called Innovisor, which can actually identify the 3% of people who drive 90% of the conversations in an organization.
Right. That's interesting. And you're saying that, and I know that you say that in the past, internal communications was very much top down, which is you will do what you're told. Whereas now there's a top down and there's a bottom up, because what we're seeing is that, and certainly from the research that we do, is that people want to engage with people and what people think and what people their people belief systems and what people want to express, rather than necessarily a corporate position.
Well, I mean, there's always been top down, there's always been bottom up, and there's always been lateral. I mean, communication has always been multi-directional. It's just only been the last few years where organizations have realized that it makes little sense to solely push top down, because there's a frustration that the top down communications don't work in and of themselves, and they actually create a less participative culture and a less enthusiastic, less engaged culture. And I think companies would have figured this out earlier if they weren't trying to push for increases in employee engagement scores, but instead we're looking at things like alignment and things that would actually involve active cooperation between employees and the business, and the leadership, on a strategic as well as a tactical level. With employee engagement, everything has gotten aggregated to a single score. And that's really convenient if you really want to benchmark against the company across the street. But it's completely inconvenient if you want to figure out what would leverage to actually improve or address the issues in the score.
Give us an example.
So, the classic example is the infamous Gallup Q12 study, where they have 12 different criteria. The best known being, do you have a best friend at work? Now, you could incentivize an internal communications function or a line manager till you're blue in the face. They're not going to make people have a best friend at work. I don't know of anybody who's used the Q12 as an impetus for running a speed dating service between colleagues. But that's kind of what it would take if you wanted to influence that particular measure.
And so we've always had, formal and informal discussions going on. We have informal discussions. In the UK, we get on a pub when all the smokers basically go outside, or in London we go to coffee shops and stuff like that. So how is it that we get a discussion going within the organization and a conversation going within the organization?
Well, it really depends. It's funny that you mentioned the smoking area, because in the late 90s I was interviewed by the Independent in the UK about the power of smoking areas. And smoking areas had two sources of power. One was that even in the late 90s, when smoking started, was starting its really long decline into consumptive obscurity, that you had enough smokers, but they were fairly rare in an individual part of the organization. So the smoking area, by definition, became very multifunctional. It also became somewhat less stratified, because you had a lot fewer young smokers than you did middle-aged smokers. So so the conversation was lots of people from different parts of the company, but at a certain status level. And so it became really critical for that group of people to cross-fertilize each other with. And nothing's really replaced, the uniqueness of the smoking area as a crucible of cross-functional communication. But what you're seeing today on platforms like Smarp and others is people engaging in conversation and particularly highlighting and encouraging people to consume specific pieces of content. And that's really a function of sender credibility, it's a function of content quality, and it's a function of relevance. One of my colleagues put out a piece, within a company, and it got, about a third of the company to look at it overnight.
Right.
I put out a piece of a similar time, maybe only 10% looked at it. I also put out a lot more than most people. So it's also a function of total share of voice. But it's not a substitute for that smoking area, but it's a different way to do it, and it's something that's going to become increasingly important as we move towards remote or partially remote workplaces coming out of this COVID exercise.
How do you see the remote working, some people call it network working, actually changing the way that we work?
It will change a number of dimensions. For people in an organization, they will become at least as reliant as they were on their networks before they left the office. You want to get something done, you don't walk down the hall, but you ping somebody. And you pretty much, and chances are you either know who to ping or you know who to ping to find the right person to ping. And that's for kind of mid to long-term incumbents in an organization. You're then going to have people coming into the organization from the outside. And I don't see enough thought going into remote onboarding right now. I'm kind of playing in that space myself, partially for that reason. But remote onboarding is a fundamentally different game to traditional in-person onboarding. Traditional in-person onboarding has really been about, getting people au fait with the systems, the infrastructure of the organization, the physical infrastructure, the technical infrastructure. Remote onboarding has a lot more to do with getting people on board with the social infrastructure of the organization. And that's a much different ballgame. How do you get people to the point where they've got a functioning, effective network so that they can do their jobs? Not because it's the right thing to do, not because they want people to get deeply embedded in the culture, but just so that somebody shows up for work on Monday, that person is at least semi-functional by 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks, after their arrival, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to justify the position.
It's interesting that you talk about networks now being central to the way that people work, and certainly, I've worked in organisations where network was so important. But now that we're working in this remote way or semi-remote way, as you say, we're not going to be able to walk down the corridor or not. I'm just popping in, or let's go for coffee or something like that. That's just not going to happen. So we're seeing certainly some of the behaviors that we've learned on social, and actually we're now needing to use them in the workplace. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, the workplace is effectively a social environment as of now, particularly the remote or even semi-remote workplace. You're not simply at the you don't have people at your physical beck and call, and you've got different kinds of visibility. Somebody could be sitting in the office and thinking about something else, and you would never know. If somebody's on Zoom and they're distracted, everyone's wondering, what that person is doing. But another perspective on it is that, we've gone from workplaces that say have 3,000 people in 3 locations to having 3,000 people in 3,000 locations. So there's this physical distribution of the organization in addition to the communication distribution of the organization. That's changed, and that will likely change further when organizations start to realize, they can engage people wherever they want. I mean, if they go the physical road, they're going to continue to limit themselves to their geographies in terms of talent. If they go away from the physical route, they can get talent anywhere.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that you mentioned to me, I remember, was that this difference between the fact that social has become work, work has become social. Explain that to us.
Well, part of it is when you look at employee advocacy, particularly, the role of the employee as somebody who engages on behalf of their organization to their community, is increasingly a part of the job. It's increasingly an expectation. It's also, a desire. When you're if you're somebody in a company, you don't want the company to do badly. If you genuinely, if you're having any semblance of a satisfying experience, you're not necessarily going to want to withhold your assistance when it's reasonably easy to give and reasonably painless to give. So the notion that employee advocacy is something, as a social media activity that's additional to work, is increasingly at odds with reality. There's this whole idea underneath that view that there is such a thing as a 9-to-5 work schedule, which is also going out the window with the remote workplace. I mean, people are getting their commutes back, but there's a reply, which is that, you may need to be on duty a bit more frequently and a bit more untraditionally than you're expected to be. And, just as taking an email at 11 o'clock in the evening falls into that category, so does, sharing out the, the latest item to those people who you think might be interested in it.
And you see this merger taking place of the fact, if we're working from home, we're working and we're at home, and this merger of using the capabilities that we've got from social in our daily lives.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, whether it's external social platforms or internal platforms like Smarp, the ability to share, the ability to message, the ability to communicate to larger, small groups of people, is something that's increasingly reaching a common level within organizations. I mean, part of it is that up until the last 2 or 3 years, the internal tools were so much weaker in terms of their usability to employees that employees didn't want to necessarily engage with them any more than they had to. But now you start to see internal tool platforms and tools of comparable quality to the external apps and platforms. And so the resistance to, engaging in work activity in a social context or social activity in a work context is becoming more and more blurred.
And how do you see, is there a way that you can measure this? And do you think that organizations should be measuring this, or is this just like, this is what we do now?
Well, I mean, it depends on why they would measure it. I mean, do they want to measure the value of it? Do they want to measure the compliance rate of employees or the participation rate of employees? Or do they want to figure out which activities offer the most bang for the buck? I mean, once they figure that question out, then they can look at what their measurement strategy is going to be. And certainly in internal comms, there's a huge amount of opportunity for people who are opportunistic about measurement, because it's not something that the field has done particularly well, much to its detriment. But you can now start to look at the language that people use, the priorities that people give, and the extent to which they align with um, those that are at the stated priorities, values, or purpose of the organization. And then if you find a gap, then the organization's got something really concrete to work out. Either to close the gap or admit that the gap between the aspirational and the actual has to be shifted one way or the other.
So this is about finding advocates within your organizations, or people that are willing to engage. In Lincoln's time, it's the people that are willing to actually go out and vote.
Well, I think once you get into the space of having to attack a gap in between stated or actual values, purpose, or priorities, then you really need to figure out who you're going to mobilize to close that gap or move the organization from one position to the other. So, say prime example. I'm not naming a particular company, but you've got a company that says it's all about sustainability.
Mm.
And the reality is, what the company does is produce a lot of stuff that doesn't end up getting recycled. Are you really all in for sustainability? Are you really all in for selling a bunch of stuff? Or if you're all in for sustainability, how do you bring the rest of the organization in? And how do you get them to change not just their attitudes, but their actual behaviors and what they get measured on, so that they're moving into this, into alignment with this approach?
Fascinating. And in these current difficult times, do you think people need to be understanding who their advocates are?
Absolutely. I mean, if anything, if companies are going to be reducing staffs by 10, 20, 30, 70, 80%, and they haven't done the homework to figure out who their advocates are, they are going to be destroying far more value than just the sheer numbers would indicate.
Hmm.
Because not only are you, when you're getting rid of your advocates, not only do you not have any advocates to replace them with, or influencers particularly, not only, you're going to leave a vacuum where a lot of the work got done and a lot of the connections were made, but you're going to have a lot of people thinking twice before they engage themselves in any constructive way, other than just simply showing up and doing the minimum.
And how do you incubate good advocacy, both internally and externally?
That's the $80 billion question, because that's very company specific. If you're a company that has values, vision, purpose, mission, then obviously finding the people who share that commitment is a really good starting point. If you're a company that doesn't have those things, I hope that if you don't have those things, you don't say that you do, because then you're creating, another bit of chaos on top of everything else. But you need to figure out, okay, who your most motivated people are, and particularly who your most motivated people are from the perspective of engaging with peers, colleagues, and customers, as opposed to, those who are the most compliant. And this is where HR comes into the issue, because, when I talk to Innovisor about how do you identify influencers, aside from doing the kind of serious social network research that they do, they say, well, the one thing you shouldn't do is ask the HR department. And there's a rationale for that, because the HR department thinks the people who are cooperative are the people who are influential.
Yes.
and who's cooperative with an HR department.
Yeah. And I guess sometimes it's the Steve Jobs, it's the Mavericks, and the I can't remember what his quote was, but sometimes it may be people that are a little bit out there, but are actually your biggest advocates.
Yeah. And also your biggest advocates for what? I mean, if your agenda is shifting from being service-oriented to being efficiency-oriented, then you need to find out who your efficiency advocates are. Because you might be able to turn the service advocates into efficiency advocates but you got to brief them on the rationale. You can't just say, okay, we're pushing efficiency now. So you got to say, look, we go out of business in 6 months if we don't get this sorted out. You got to be with us.
Mike, it's been fascinating. I could actually go and talk for you for ages. When we actually did the prep call, I know it went on for an hour, which is the longest call I've had. It's been really fascinating. We are at 30 minutes, so I don't want to take all more of your time. It goes very, very quickly. It's been, I love meeting people. I love doing this because I meet people and I learn stuff, and it's been fantastic. So remind people again where they can get hold of you. It's Mike Klein, isn't it? Your email address.
It's Mike, MIKE.KLEIN @changingtheterms.com, or you can find me as Mike Klein at LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Mike, really appreciate you spending the time today and sharing your expertise and knowledge. And I wish you all well with your move to Iceland.
Thank you very much.
It's a beautiful place, and I'm very jealous.
Well, you'll have to come see us sometime.
Absolutely. I'd love to come. Having been to Iceland before, I'd love to go again. So when travel starts again, maybe.
Excellent. We'd love to see you.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Great to talk to you today. Well,
thank you. Bye.